Happy Friday, gamers! This is John Arnhem, the Indie Detective, and this is episode 3 of the Indie Detective Reviews. Hold on to your seats, we've got 3 new indie game titles that I think you're gonna like. First on the list, we have PAKO2, an arcade getaway driving game where you play the bad guy trying to get away with the heist money. And then for what is our third driving game of the Indie Detective Reviews, we have Jalopy, a road tripping simulator where you drive the worst car you could possibly imagine of through the old countries of the Soviet Eastern Bloc. And finally, what is probably my favorite indie game title that we've covered here on Indie Game Reviews so far, Rogue-lite adventure game The Flame and the Flood, where you're trying to escape a natural disaster that has flooded the rural American landscape. So, we're about to get started, but before we take off, here's how we do things on the Indie Detective. We go pretty fast, so try to keep up. For each game, we start off with a basic overview of the game, such as the plot and the genre basics. Tell you a little bit about the development and the developer history, especially for early access titles, and how the game is doing so far. Next, we cover some of the gameplay basics, like the scoring mechanics, the difficulty, and whether any bugs are really causing issues. And finally, and this is where this channel really shines, we talk about the viability and value of these games, how much it costs, and whether it's worth it. What's really important here is the state of early access and Greenlight titles. And here we talk about the completeness of the game, the content so far, and how they're doing updating the game and getting rid of those nasty early access bugs. Well, that's enough of an introduction, I think. You know what's in store for you, so let's get right into the first review. Just like last week's episode, we're starting off this week's episode with a driving game, but unlike Taco-Apocalypse, PAKO2 is not super lighthearted. It is some serious arcade mayhem. This game comes to us from Tree Men Games, a 3-man studio from Finland who developed the original PAKO for mobile in 2014, but just released that title on Steam in January, so this is actually their second Steam release in just 3 months. The original PAKO was a time trial infinite run game for mobile, where if you crashed into anything you died. The developer's vision for this game was to make it bigger, with huge towns, better drifting, and faster action that kept you engaged for a long time. So what the developers did is they threw out the idea of a time trial and decided to make it where you pick up crews with increasing difficulty over time, bigger maps, and a completely different gameplay mechanic. Now, like I said, this is an early access title, but the content is there. It's still kind of limited, but we'll get to that later. So next up, gameplay basics. PAKO plays using really simple arcade controls. You can either use WASD and a mouse or a dual-stick controller. One hand drives, one hand shoots, and you have handbrake buttons and boost buttons. The controller, I have got to say, is way easier than the mouse and the keyboard. You have a targeting reticle using the mouse that disappears, and you lose track of it, making it very difficult. Scoring is done in cold, hard cash, multiplied as the game goes on. What differs from PAKO, where the objective is to stay alive, here it's objective-based. You drive compass-assisted from robbery to getaway point, and every time you successfully help the bad guys get away, it increases your multiplier, giving you way more cash. Now, I'm not sure if this game is hard, or if the controls are just wonky, or maybe I need a serious shot of get-good juice, but I can't get my multiplier very high enough to afford the $7,000 armor upgrades or a $40,000 van, but there are achievements for getting things like $100,000 in a run, which I think is just absolutely crazy. Now, like I mentioned before, the difficulty increases with time. Every time you complete an objective, there are more, tougher pursuit vehicles coming after you. You've got guns for blowing them up, but it's really easy to get distracted. Running into everything in this world can kill you, so you've really got to keep an eye on the road, and that's why I think using the controller is a superior option. When you're using a mouse, the targeting reticle disappears and you have to spend time with your eyes away from what's in front of you looking for where you're aiming. As far as this gamer is concerned, it's the most annoying feature of the game, that something that's designed for PC should not have intuitive mouse controls. But the entertainment value of PAKO in arcade games like it is in its replayability. It's very easy to shake off a loss, get back in your car and start making runs again, and the frantic pace of the game, set to the Finnish DJ DKSTR soundtrack, makes it very engaging, and it's really easy to lose a lot of time playing it. And that sounds like the transition I need to start talking about viability and value of PAKO. As an early access title, this is something that we really try to focus on here at the Indie Detective channel. Because we all know that the worst sin an early access title can commit is to be a barely functional tech demo, which is basically just a cash grab from the developers. Fortunately, Tree Men Games is not pulling that on us here. This is a fully formed game with some handcrafted maps and pretty good content. I'll say that this is a good arcade experience, even though that's not normally what I'm into. The replayability is good, but it's not super engaging outside of the soundtrack, which is pretty darn good. It can be frustrating at times due to the fragile car and how long it takes to upgrade things. But the game is only $5 on Steam, which is about the price I would expect from an indie arcade title. But what hurts the value for me is the difficulty curve. Having $7,000 be your first armor upgrade when you only earn about $300 per successful run, that means that you're putting a lot of time to even get past the first difficulty hurdle. And cards on the table, I didn't spend that much time on this game. I never got past that first difficulty hurdle, so that does hurt the value for me, and I think it's something that should be addressed in future updates. But that's where the good part is. The fact that Treeman Studios is a veteran studio that's been making games for 3 years now gives me hope that this will be addressed, things will be changed as they add content, they will also change a bit of the gameplay. So I think that viability is good, even if the value currently is questionable. So that is the detective's verdict on PAKO2. While I think the viability is there and Treeman Games will continue to give us good content for the product that they've created, the value is currently only there for arcade gamers and not for people who want a laid-back experience. This is something that you've really got to be willing to soak some time or a little bit of effort into. For our next review, we're taking a trip back in time and space to the old Soviet Eastern Bloc in 1990. This is Jalopy, a road-tripping simulator where you drive around a Leica Deluxe 601, the East German Republic's homegrown vehicle. Named after Leica the space dog, the first animal to ever enter orbit, this vehicle is, well, a piece of crap is saying it nicely. Everything on it breaks down from even the slightest bit of abuse, and you'll find yourself having to repair it time and time again, and that's really what makes this game. Because this is not your standard road tripping simulator. The scenery is not as fantastic as, say, Euro Truck Simulator, and the driving itself is pretty clunky. But what does make this game interesting is that it's a scavenging and resource managing driving game. See, the Leica 601 that you're driving in this game is based on real-life piece-of-crap car, the Trabant 601, built in the Eastern German Republic between 1963 and 1990. It's a thoroughly crappy car with a 2-stroke engine and a crap set of tires you're going to be replacing every couple hundred miles. Luckily for you, the Soviet bloc is collapsing and there's only 3 cops per country, so what you will do is find cargo littered all over the sides of roads that you can scavenge and sell off at border towns. And before I start talking about how much content this early access game has out, I need to talk a little bit about the developer Minskworks. It's a single-man developer, a guy named Greg, I'm gonna butcher this, Prijmachuk. He worked for Rare on projects like Viva Pinata and Banjo-Kazooie's Nuts and Bolts, so he has a pretty great AAA pedigree. This game was originally conceived of as a project called Hodge, where you'd be driving your ailing uncle from the German Eastern Republic back home to Turkey. But somewhere during the development phase, Greg decided to rebrand the game from Hodge to Jalopy, focusing less on the grand pilgrimage through Europe and more on the car itself. But this is still an early access title, so there's plenty of time to bring those story elements back into the game at a later point. The gameplay is currently stopped at the Turkish border, but that country is currently in development and there's a testing server up right now for that. So I'll be interested to see whether the developer tries to embrace the storyline premise of Hodge or continues to develop the mechanics of repair and driving behind Jalopy. Well, that was a lot of information for a basic overview, but let's dive into the gameplay a little bit. This game revolves around 2 central aspects, like I talked about: loot, scavenging, and money management. Driving is almost secondary. Saving money on tires and fuel is really what you want to focus on here. Now, I hesitate to call this a rogue anything, but there are procedurally generated routes with selection of terrain, weather, and loot, maybe a petrol station here and there, and it's designed to get harder as you go away from Deutschland. Like Bulgaria, when you get there, is an absolute hellscape. Like all games should, this game starts out pretty easy. You've got 100 marks in your wallet, some spare tires, all the good parts that you need. The first rough road that you hit changes everything. You hit mud, potholes, you hydroplane on pools of water, and it tears up your tires, which is very expensive. Fortunately, the longer routes you take, the better chances are that you find some loot crates lying around which give you valuable contraband for you to sell off at the next border town. That can buy you enough money to stay at the local hotel and to get some new tires for your vehicle. An interesting feature of Jalopy is that all of these Eastern European countries have localized branding and signage, so all the items that you find will change based on what country you find them in. Now, the game's item system is really easy to exploit right now. If you just find a case of wine lying on the ground, you can re-roll the game's rudimentary supply and demand system to a point where you're always selling wine for a very high price, and you can end up with a lot of money in your wallet very early on, which takes all the challenge and charm out of the game. After all, there has to be some threat of failure, and in this game that comes when you completely run out of money from scrapping all the parts on your vehicle and selling everything you have in your trunk to a point where you can't afford to pay for a motel, because you only drive through one country a day and your clock will stall at midnight, so until you sleep you cannot move on, and if you cannot pay for a hotel for the night, that's it, the game's over. You've got to go back home, pick up some spare tires from your uncle's garage and go pawn those off. So if you embrace these challenges, it makes the game really fun, but if you break it for yourself, you're not going to have any. Because the driving right now is nothing special. The terrain is very samey, you're always going to be spinning out and hydroplaning on mud and water, so it's not a great driving simulator. But as far as the resource management goes, it's pretty in-depth, and I really like that about it. So that's about all there is to say about game... Wow, voice break! That's about all there is to say about the gameplay in Jalopy, so let's move on to talking about viability and value. Like I said, the gameplay itself is not so fleshed out as, say, PAKO, but it's also a much bigger game. And, pardon the pun, but it has so many moving parts that some of it bugging out is to kind of be expected. It took me about 7 hours and failing a few times to where I got lucky, found a ton of medicine lying on the side of the road, and had the resources to make it all the way to the end of the game, through Romania and Bulgaria down to the Turkish border. So I picked this up on a 50% off Steam sale, which unfortunately is over. Sorry I couldn't get this review episode out fast enough. So I only paid $6.50 for the game. It's currently back up to $13. So I got a really great value out of this early access title so far. But what I'm really looking forward to is that you can clearly see where the content's going to come from. The fact that the Turkey map is already under development and that there is a clear, pardon again the pun, roadmap for where this game's going, you can really expect more content to be coming out at a regular pace in the future. So I think that speaks really highly for its viability moving forward as an early access title, but as for its value right now, $13 US or 10 euros, it's kind of a mixed bag. The terrain is very samey, and the driving is a little punishing. Like I said, you're always hitting mud and spinning out on the water. But the loot and scrapping bits are really quite rewarding. If you find an entirely upgraded engine just lying on the side of the road waiting for you, that'll give you the rewarding push that you need to make it to the end of the game. And there's potential for more off-road secrets to be added later. There are already junkyards added to the game, which I don't think you can access, at least I didn't find out how to do it. But yeah, finding these things and solving those puzzles is potential for great reward later on. So if you're the kind of gamer like me who likes to sign on to early access titles that have a promise of great new content to come, like a game like Subnautica, then this is going to be the game for you. But you're going to have to wait a little bit longer because, like I said, it is a one-man developer, and unless he hires an artist, you're going to be getting a lot of the same visual aspects of the content, but I think that it's worth the investment just to, help your indie developers out. That's how we really push this industry forward and make great content in the future, is by supporting these indie developers. So the detective's verdict on Jalopy, I think it's got some great viability because there's a lot of content that you can see just over the horizon. As far as value, I'd say look for it on Steam sale. But you can definitely help support this developer by buying into his early access title. I don't think it's a cash grab. This guy's got a great pedigree, and I'm really looking forward to see what Jalopy can become in the future. If you've never experienced an indie title where the studio had a really great art direction team and they met up with an excellent soundtrack artist, I want this to be the first game that you find. There's already been games like Bastion and Transistor that have met these criterion, but this is the Flame in the Flood, and it's really an excellent example of this. This game comes to us from a studio called the Molasses Flood, whose founder Gwen Fry was the art director on BioShock Infinite over at Irrational Games. The rest of the Molasses Flood team has an equally impressive pedigree, coming from games like Halo, Rock Band, and Guitar Hero. What they've managed to create is a really special experience. In this game, a natural disaster has flooded this rural American landscape, when a young girl named Scout meets up with her new canine friend Aesop, a scrappy little beagle, and start their journey down the river to salvation. All you have is a small raft, many miles to go, and many dangers to overcome. That's the basic premise of The Flame in the Flood. It is a rogue-lite survival game. And in the interest of giving credit where credit is due, what you're hearing right now is the guitar stylings of alt-country artist Chuck Ragan. And this game would not be the same without the music that gives it its atmospheric feel and really gets you engaged with the story and the character. And I think I would be remiss if I didn't point out that this entire soundtrack is available on YouTube and iTunes, and if you like this game as much as I did, I would definitely consider buying it and supporting that artist. Now, unlike the other two titles we've reviewed today, this is not an early access game. It is a complete title, but they are continuing to patch some of the bugs. It's been out for about 2 months and has just absolutely rave reviews, and I'm adding my voice to that. This is a fantastic game. Let's get into some of the gameplay. As I mentioned before, in The Flame in the Flood, you play as Scout and Aesop, your beagle companion / alarm / pack animal. This game is a roguelite title in that it randomly generates the play area and associated challenges. Death is semi-permanent because you can reload to the checkpoint at the end of the last zone that you cleared, and you can store items on Aesop so that if you restart your campaign, Aesop brings them back to your newly spawned character. There are two ways to play the game, the first of which is an endless river that keeps spawning new zones of increasing difficulty as you go. The second is a 10-zone story mode that features Scout's journey to reach the end of the flooded river. Similarly, there are also two difficulties, the harder of which starts with less storage space, with very scarce supplies, and it gets cold a lot faster, meaning that you'll die of hypothermia if you don't increase and improve your clothing. And hypothermia is just one of the ways to die. There are lots of things out there to kill you. There are wild boars that don't like you encroaching on their territory, snakes that will ambush and bite you, and even the occasional bear that you'll run across that will maul you for getting too close to his den. The essential gameplay elements combine exploration with a very well-balanced crafting system. There are not an overwhelming number of crafting items for you to deal with, and it's necessary for you to craft in order to avoid the multiplicity of hazards that you'll face. As the game goes on, you'll need to improve your tools, your weapons, and your clothing, or you won't be able to handle the hazards of the later stages of the game. Similarly, since much of the game involves rafting down the river, you'll need to upgrade your raft with things like a rudder or maybe a stove to keep you warm, otherwise you'll find yourself facing a very difficult journey at the end. Overall, I found the difficulty curve very compelling, and the game itself just very fun and well balanced. When it's all laid over Ragan's soundtrack, it's so absorbing and heartwarming. It's all upbeat and hopeful, despite the overwhelming hardship that the story involves. Now, since this is a completed title from a pretty good studio, I don't feel like I have a whole lot to talk about on viability and value. What I'm going to talk about instead is why my impression is so much better than what's listed on Metacritic. On Metacritic, it scores a mere 73, most of the reviews citing it being repetitive, often frustrating, and there's something to be said for this game on repetition, but its similar assets are randomly placed based on the zone that you're in. And honestly, the random generation is done so well that I didn't find it repetitive at all until I reached the end of the game, read the reviews, and then thought about it in retrospect. You know, often user reviews are way more harsh than the critical reviews, and there is a 0 of 0 score on Metacritic where a person complained that because the keys weren't rebindable, the game was literally unplayable. Now, unless you have one arm and rebindability is actually something that you need, literally unplayable, you've just shot your credibility, bro. This game is only $15 on Steam, and it's really a great experience, more than worth that amount of money, especially I got it on a Steam sale, so go me, and I spent about 9 hours getting through the story. I'm now enjoying playing the Endless River mode on an increased difficulty. So as far as the detective's verdict on this, I think it ranks very highly for a survival game, and Scout's reckon I oughta try it attitude and the uptempo pace set for it really set it apart from what is often a very dark and morose genre. And I can't harp on it enough, the soundtrack is just fantastic, and I think that is what really makes this one of my favorite games that I've ever played, especially one of my favorite indie game titles. I can't recommend this highly enough. I think I'm going to try Twitch streaming it as my first indie game Twitch stream. So yeah, I want you to go out and buy this game. Give the Molasses Flood a reason to keep making fantastic games. Well, that is all for our episode today, gamers. Thanks for tuning in. I will see you next week for another episode of the Indie Detective Reviews, but in the meantime, I encourage you to check out these developers and their games. Give them all the support that you possibly can, because indie games are our lifeblood. They are what keeps this industry afloat. You'll find links to these games' Steam pages and the developers' Twitter feeds in the description below, as well as a link to Chuck Ragan's soundtrack here on YouTube. I really encourage you to check all those out and give those developers some support. And of course, if you want the freshest in indie game content, be sure to subscribe here to the Indie Detective channel. Throughout the week, release gameplay videos of some of the things that we've been playing, and every Friday, a new episode of the Indie Detective Reviews. 3 new indie games that we really enjoyed and think you might enjoy investing your time and money into. So, until next week, gamers, this has been John Arnhem, the Indie Detective, signing off. Keep on gaming.
Chasing horizon in the flame.